In New York today, the UN Security Council unanimously approved a resolution endorsing a peace process for Syria. The resolution calls for a ceasefire and talks between the Syrian government and Syrian opposition. This meeting of the United Nations Security Council was chaired by Secretary of State John Kerry and is just over 2 hours.
The 7,588th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. I want to warmly welcome the distinguished Secretary General, the ministers, and the other distinguished representatives present in the Security Council chamber today. Your presence here underscores the importance of the subject that is under discussion here today. Now, in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin the consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor. Let me just say to everybody, we have a number of ministers who have flight schedules to meet, and this went on a little longer than we thought, but I appreciate everybody's patience. We're very, very grateful to you. It's my honor now to give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Your Excellency, Secretary of State John Kerry and President of the Security Council, distinguished ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The Syrian conflict began with the peaceful popular demands for political change, but it soon became defined by internal, regional, and international divisions, including in this very council. Almost 5 years later, we see a country in ruins, billions of people scattered across the world, and a whirlwind of radicalism and sectarianism that challenges regional and global security. I therefore welcome the critical initiative of the International Syria Support Group. In particular, I recognize the statesmanship of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And I also welcome the resolution the Security Council will adopt at this meeting. As the first resolution to focus on the political path to resolving the crisis, this marks a very important step on which we must build. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the distinguished ministers who have taken such great leadership and participating in this meeting. Excellencies, at the 2 recent meetings in Vienna, the ISSG made 2 major requests of the United Nations. First, to convene in January formal negotiations between the Syrian government and opposition representatives focused on a Syrian-led transition process. Second, and in parallel, to determine the requirements and modalities of nationwide ceasefire. The United Nations stands ready to undertake these important tasks. We welcome the meeting convened in Riyadh that brought together a broad spectrum of the Syrian opposition. As the government and opposition delegations are getting ready, the United Nations stands ready to relaunch intra-Syrian talks mediated by my special envoy, Mr. Staffan de Mistura. As set out in the Geneva Communique, the parties must ensure the full and effective participation of women in these talks. This morning, at a meeting, I urged the ISSG to apply the necessary pressure on the Syrian parties to immediately implement the following confidence-building measures. First, stop the use of indiscriminate weapons against the civilians, including barrel bombs, which have continued despite the government's pledge to refrain from such assault. Second, allow unconditional and unimpeded access for aid convoys. Tens of thousands of people in besieged areas have been forced to live on grass and weeds. This is outrageous. Third, halt attacks on medical and educational facilities and lift all restrictions on medical and surgical supplies from humanitarian convoys. Fourth, release all detainees. Reports indicate that prisoners face torture and atrocious conditions. Mr. President, distinguished council members, nearly 2 years have passed since the Geneva II conference. The people of Syria have suffered enough. I call for you to show vision and leadership in overcoming your differences. A fleeting opportunity for peace has emerged. Your duty is to seize it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, and I think everybody here joins in thanking you for your leadership and for all the help of the United Nations. The Council is now ready to proceed to a vote on the draft resolution before it. Members of the Council have before them document S/2015/996, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the United States of America. I will put this draft resolution to a vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2015/996 please raise their hand? The result of the voting is clear. It is the draft resolution has received 15 votes in favor, and therefore the draft resolution has been adopted unanimously as Resolution 2254 of 2015. I will now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State of the United States. Mr. Secretary General, Special Envoy de Mistura, distinguished colleagues, I want to begin by thanking the other P4 members who joined together to help fashion this resolution and who spent time this morning working with our colleagues in order to bring us here this afternoon, plus our non-P4 member, Germany, for whom we are very grateful for their participation also. I want to thank all the members of the Council for coming together at this late hour. And I thank you in particular, Secretary General Ban and Special Envoy de Mistura, for your leadership and your commitment. I also want to thank Foreign Minister Lavrov for his collaboration and his efforts over the course of both Vienna conferences to produce the 2 Vienna communiques that are integrated into this resolution here today. By approving Resolution 2254 today, this Council is sending a clear message to all concerned that the time is now to stop the killing in Syria and lay the groundwork for a government that the long-suffering people of that battered land can support. After 4.5 years of war, this is the first time we have been able to come together at the United Nations in the Security Council to embrace a road forward. During that time, 1 Syrian in 20 has been killed or wounded. 1 in 5 is a refugee. 1 in 2 has been displaced. The average life expectancy in Syria has dropped by 20 years. We need to reverse the course, and that is the Council's goal here this afternoon, to put an end to the indiscriminate bombing, the acts of terror, the torture, and the bloodshed. And our shared task is to find a way to make that happen. In support of this objective, President Obama has set for my country 3 interrelated goals. The first is to support our friends and to ensure that the instability created by the civil war in Syria does not spread further beyond its borders. And that is why we're providing a record amount of humanitarian assistance. And it's why we're doing more to help Syria's neighbors to strengthen their capacity to safeguard their territory and to defend against external threats. Second, we are determined with our coalitional partners to degrade and defeat the terrorist organization known as Daesh. In the past half year, the coalition and its partners have worked with Iraqi forces in liberating Tikrit, freeing Sinjar, removing terrorist commanders from the battlefield, cutting off terrorist supply lines, hitting their oil facilities, and depriving Daesh of more and more of the territory that it once controlled. Now we are intensifying the pressure, helping our Iraqi partners retake most of Ramadi to squeeze supply routes into Mosul, and we are pushing ahead into northern Syria, assisting our partners along the Iraqi-Syrian border and on the recruiting and propaganda efforts. Further, as evidenced by the finance ministerial that was held right here in this very chamber yesterday, we are multiplying our efforts to cut Daesh off from the revenue sources that support its depravity, its criminality. But the truth is that nothing would do more to bolster the fight against the terrorists than a broadly supported diplomatic process that gives the Syrian people a real choice, not a choice between Assad or Daesh, but between war and peace, between the violent extremes and a newly empowered political center. That is why we have joined with so many of you in support of an urgent diplomatic initiative. Again and again, countries, not just around this dais today, but countless meetings in various parts of the world have reaffirmed the notion that there has to be a political settlement. Well, this is the test. This is why we've joined here in a broader, more action-oriented effort than ever before attempted regarding Syria to isolate the terrorists and to put Syria on the road to a political transition envisioned by the Geneva Communique, now embraced by the international community in a United Nations Security Council resolution. As the Council's action today reflects, we have made important progress in recent weeks, and progress that should give us all fresh grounds for encouragement. Last month in Vienna, the United States and other members of the International Syria Support Group agreed on a series of steps to stop the bleeding in Syria, to advance a political transition, to isolate the terrorists, and to help the Syrian people to be able to begin to rebuild their country. Last week in Riyadh, with the support of His Majesty King Salman and his government, a broad cross-section of Syrian opposition representatives came together to form a high committee for negotiation. Under the resolution approved today, the purpose of those negotiations between the responsible opposition and the government is to facilitate a transition within Syria to a credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance within 6 months. The process would lead to the drafting of a new constitution and arrangements for internationally supervised election within 18 months. I might add, Geneva never had those dates. It is the Vienna process and the Vienna communique that has produced a 6-month and 18-month time horizon. And it is the Vienna process that also has embraced the ceasefire concept as well as embraced a set of principles and values about the shape that a new Syria might be able to take as directed by Syrians for Syrians. It's our hope that a nationwide ceasefire can go into effect excluding only Daesh and al-Nusra and any other group that we might decide at some time to designate. So I would close by saying we're under no illusions about the obstacles that exist. There obviously remain sharp differences within the international community, especially about the future of President Assad. We have emphasized from the beginning that for this to work, the process has to be led and shaped and decided and implemented by the men and women of Syria. It cannot be imposed from the outside, and we are not seeking to do so. But we've also seen in recent weeks in Vienna, in Paris, and in other capitals, and then today here in New York, an unprecedented degree of unity on the need to negotiate this political transition, to defeat Daesh, and then indeed to end the war. The resolution that we just approved is a milestone because it sets out specific concepts with specific time frames. Accordingly, we need to work hard together to help these political talks to go forward, to prepare for a ceasefire, and to encourage all the parties in Syria to participate in good faith. In closing, let me just underscore the urgency of our task. Like many of you, I've met with refugees in and out of refugee camps. I've met with survivors, as you have, met with caregivers, as you have, met with many of the people who've been on the front lines of this conflict. I've talked to women who've struggled to hold their families together despite constant danger, bitter cold, shortages of food, and great danger. I've heard the blood-chilling stories of doctors and relief workers who've been dealing with humanitarian trauma on a daily basis, month after month, year after year, now into the 5th year. I am aware, as everybody in this chamber is, of the atrocities that have been committed and are being committed, even as we sit here this afternoon, and being committed too often against innocent civilians. Looking ahead, we know that Daesh can never be allowed to gain control in Syria. So we have a global imperative here to deal with a terrorist entity, but also to end the civil war and to bring legitimacy back to the governance of Syria. President Assad, in our judgment, and not everybody shares this, but the majority of the people in the ISSG believe that President Assad has lost the ability, the credibility, to be able to unite the country and to provide the moral credibility to be able to govern it into the future. So I just say, not as a matter of ideology, not as a matter of choice, but purely as a matter of reality, as a matter of fact, given the situation on the ground, that if the war is to end, it is imperative that the Syrian people agree on an alternative in terms of their governance. That logic is compelling, and it provides a unifying principle for most people in our efforts going forward. We have a lot of distance to travel. Some would say miles to go. But the truth is that in the past 2 months, we have started from a standstill, from a non-existent process, to have 3 separate meetings of the ISSG and now a United Nations Security Council embrace of a process. We have agreed on a plan of action, and the Council's vote today is an important boost on the road to a political settlement. It is a particularly important step because it reaffirms this body's endorsement of the Geneva Communique about the transitional governing body with full executive authority. And it also endorses the progress and the statements that we made in Vienna to set a timeline for transition, a timeline for election, and standards for that election, the highest standards under the supervision of the United Nations for a free, fair, transparent, and accountable election. It also brings fundamental values and principles that can guide the shaping of Syria by Syrians for Syrians. So let us proceed with confidence from here and the determination to end this war, eliminate the terrorist threat, and enable the people of Syria to return safely to their homes. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, first and foremost, I'd like to thank John Kerry for his initiative to conduct today in New York the 3rd meeting of the ISSG. This has been a time to meet in this room. The meeting of the ISSG underscored the commitment of all its participants to the Vienna process. The resolution just adopted approved the 14 November 2015 agreement that spoke of a way to implement the Geneva Communique from 30 June 2012. Here it's clearly set forth, first and foremost, that all 3 documents are a single platform for resolving the bloody Syrian crisis. Secondly, that the Vienna format is the only one which will bring together all influential foreign players to ensure a context for sustainable and fair settlement through talks between the government of the Syrian Arab Republic and the whole span of the opposition. The resolution provides an international law weight to collective work for such negotiations under the SRSG, Stefan de Mistura. Here, it is underscored that only Syrian-led inclusive dialogue can put an end to the untold suffering of the Syrian people. Here, there is also affirmation of the fundamental principles of the political settlement, namely that Syria should remain unified, secular, pluri-religious, and pluri-ethnic, comfortable and safe for all groups of its people. Not only the Syrian people itself can define its future. This is a clear response to attempts to impose a solution from the outside on Syrians on any issues, including those regarding its president. This approach is enshrined in the Geneva Communique, as well as in the document of the ISSG and in today's resolution. Furthermore, we're all united on the front that terrorists of all stripes have no place in the talks, just the same as those who would like a military solution to the crisis. The unanimous adoption today on the Council has created a broad and counterterrorism front on the basis of the UN Charter, on the basis of all of those who are pushing back against terror on the ground, including the Syrian army, the Turkish army, the armed militias, and the Syrian parts of the Syrian opposition, as well as the Russian air forces in response to the legitimate request of the Syrian Arab Republic. An important role here should be played, as we heard through the Russian and U.S. proposed resolution aimed at strengthening control or oversight over the financing of ISIL and such terrorist groups, cutting off channels for their financing, first and foremost, through cutting out the illegal trade in oil. Combating terrorism should be consistent and selfless, be it in Syria or anywhere else. It is inadmissible to divide terrorists amongst good and bad ones. The resolution underscores that there's a need to provide humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. This should be presented on the basis or strict compliance with the guiding principles of the United Nations, enshrined in GA resolutions and Security Council resolutions, including the principle of the agreement of the host country. It is important that today on the Security Council, once again, there was a repetition of the need to uphold the sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic. The adopted resolution enshrines the Security Council's oversight over the results achieved in the implementation of the Vienna Agreement with international support. The Secretary General and his special representatives or envoys, Stefan de Mistura, will play a leading role in organizing and conducting the negotiations with the Syrian opposition, those in Moscow, Cairo, Damascus, El Riyadh, Haseki, and other places. We are counting on balanced recommendations from the Secretariat to the Security Council regarding necessary steps to be taken in all areas agreed upon in Vienna. We are convinced that our colleagues in Mr. de Mistura's team will heed these instructions impartially, not engaging in any attempts to influence any one side, and be guided exclusively by the task of assisting finding mutually acceptable agreement between the government and the opposition as required by today's resolution. As these recommendations become ripe, we shall stand ready as a co-chair of the ISSG with the United States as well and the United Nations to convene another meeting to define on the basis of consensus further steps to be taken in fostering a solution to the Syrian crisis. We call upon all colleagues during the work to come to not engage in idealized rhetoric to prevent inciting interethnic hatred and be guided by the primary need to combat terrorism, find a political settlement. This is the approach to which there is no alternative if we indeed put not our geopolitical interests forward, but the interests of the Syrian people and the Syrian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Lavrov. Again, thank you for your leadership regarding this. I now have the honor of recognizing His Excellency Mr. Nasser Judah, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate.
معالي الرئيس
Mr. Chairman,
أرغب بداية أن
allow me at the outset to express my deep thanks and gratitude to the Secretary of State of the United States of America, whose country presides over the Council for this month, and to express my thanks and gratitude to him for convening this important ministerial conference that comes in pursuit of the international constructive work in order to put an end to the crisis in Syria and to put an end to the suffering of the Syrian people. Your Excellency, Excellencies, members of the Security Council, Your Excellency, the Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, our meeting today is yet another milestone in the international response to the situation in Syria. The regional as well as the international parties during the past few months sought to intensify their diplomatic efforts in order to reach a common understanding on the ways and means to realize a political settlement for the tragic crisis in Syria that has been going on for 5 years and whose dangerous repercussions are on the region and the international community, especially its humanitarian aspect that's relative to the internal displacement and the asylum seeking of millions of Syrians, and the security aspect, which is a result of the expansion of the Daesh terrorist groups and other terrorist and other related terrorist entities and people, and Nusra Front as well. These commendable international efforts have led to the establishment of the ISSG, and in this respect I would like to express my deep thanks and gratitude to Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, for their efforts in order to realize this path, which, God willing, will lead to the political solution that we all aspire for in Syria. I also wish to express my thanks to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, for his previous and for his forthcoming efforts. And we emphasize that this committee should continue working in order to ensure a political process in Syria based on the document of Geneva I and the declarations issued by our group in its 3 meetings that were held in Vienna and in New York today, and to the contents of the draft resolution that has been adopted by the Council today, which is a historical resolution that paves the way for the implementation of the political solution that we hope will put an end to the political crisis, a crisis that Syria has been facing with its people. At this respect, I wish to express our appreciation to the efforts of the sister kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which hosted the conference of the Syrian opposition at Riyadh in order to launch the political negotiations, which we hope will lead to the realization of this political solution, and to our appreciation to all those countries that have tirelessly worked in this respect. I also wish to mention that we in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan have played the role that we were asked to do by starting a coordination process between the members of the ISG in order to reach a common understanding of the groups and the individuals who could be described as terrorists. We have presented the result of our work to the ISSG, and we have explained the consensus of some countries on some terrorist groups and some groups upon which there has not been agreement in order to, and so that negotiations could continue about their designation in the future. We have said, in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, we have said, and since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, that the only solution to this crisis is the comprehensive political solution. Our position under the leadership of His Majesty King Abdullah II, son of King Al-Hussein, and his emphasis that the comprehensive political solution must be realized. This has remained our position. This has remained our conviction. We see no way to restoring normalcy in Syria and to rehabilitate the social fabric in Syria and to maintain its territorial integrity and its political independence except through the political solution. We don't see any way of defeating terrorism, extremism, and Daesh gangs, and to uproot them from Syria and from other places cannot be realized except through this comprehensive political solution upon which all the Syrians will agree and whom we should support them and help them in order to realize it, in order to save Syria and to restore international and regional peace and security. The adoption by the Security Council of this resolution today will give the necessary momentum to realize the political solution in Syria, a solution that is based on the concepts and the documents of Geneva I as a comprehensive political context and the declarations of the ISSG, and to start on a sustainable path in order to realize the political solution adopted by the resolution and to determine the time horizons and the time frames necessary and the mechanisms to review its implementation and to the fulfillment of all the obligations and to review and lay the basis for a comprehensive ceasefire, with the exception of the terrorist Daesh groups and Nusra and others, and which will lead to defeat them. And the position regarding terrorism and extremism, we lead the international efforts in order to defeat this terrorism and in order to defeat these extremist thoughts, a terrorism that spoils the image of our great religion, Islam, and its message of tolerance and its moderate calls, and all those who try to commit crimes in the name of this religion are not part of this religion. And at all parties, all the Syrian parties have to rise to the levels of the sacrifices and the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people, and to seek to realize the comprehensive political solution which could restore security, stability, and harmony to Syria, and which will lead to the uprooting of terrorism and its implications all over the world, and lay the basis for the reconstruction of Syria that lives in peace with itself, a Syria of plurality, and enables the refugees to return to their homeland. The international community in general, and this council in particular, must not allow any obstacles to be placed before the comprehensive political solution or to lead to its failure, and to take the effective measures capable of defeating any attempt to delay the realization, because the failure would have grave consequences to each and all. We have all seen conclusive evidence on the threats resulting from the absence of a political vision and a political solution. Excellency, today's momentum should spur the international community to intensify its efforts to face the crisis of the Syrian refugees, one of the most difficult and most painful humanitarian crises, especially the neighboring states that are hosting refugees, especially my country, Jordan. The number of the Syrians, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan alone, is 1,400,000 spread all over the regions of the kingdom, knowing that 9% alone of these refugees live in camps. Jordan, with its limited resources, have become the second largest host for refugees in the world. and the second largest country, the second country hosting the greatest number of Syrian refugees, with all its attendant consequences and pressures on the major sectors like health, education, security, the market, the labor market, and the infrastructure, which is costing the Jordanian treasury lots of expenses that are beyond the reach and beyond the abilities of the kingdom, Your Excellency. Jordan and its kind people have opened their houses to the refugees from Syria, especially our brothers from Syria. We have shared with them our limited resources. We, on behalf of entire humanity, we have carried out our obligation in hosting them and providing them with all that we can. We are proud of our ability to host them, a hosting that is in consonance with the principle of the Hashemite leadership. However, the world must share this burden with us, because we are performing this humanitarian duty on behalf of the entire humanity, and to help us to shoulder this burden and to work with us in accordance with the response plan which was drawn by the government of Jordan in order to alleviate the suffering of those who are living in the camps or are hosted. We look forward to the convening of the London conference next year, early next year, and we call the international community to effectively participate in that conference. Your Excellency, we are today before a real chance that should not be missed in order to take confident steps toward the realization of the political solution that will satisfy all the Syrians, which will restore stability and security to Syria, which will realize the ambitions of its people to move into a new reality, a reality that they themselves draw, that will maintain the unity of their country and their territorial integrity, and would enable us to defeat terrorism in coordination and partnership with them. From this time and place, I call on all the Syrians and the entire community to avail ourselves of this opportunity before it's too late. Your Excellency, this intervention of mine could be the last before this August Council during this tenure of Jordan as a member of the Security Council, because our membership, our non-permanent membership, will end in few days. Allow me to avail myself of this opportunity to express to the entire membership of the Council our deep thanks, gratitude for the cooperation that we have received during our non-permanent membership, which started at the beginning of 2014. I wish to express our deep thanks and gratitude to the members of the United Nations for the confidence that they gave Jordan under the leadership of His Majesty King Abdullah II by electing us as a non-permanent member of the Council. Jordan, which believes in the Charter of the United Nations, which is committed to its principles and objectives, we are all proud of the quality achievements that have been realized and the initiatives through all sectors, notably in the youth sector. I wish to refer to the various initiatives regarding Syria and the humanitarian situation in Syria, to the Palestinian question and other important issues which we work with the members of this Council in order to realize and to achieve and solve during our membership. These achievements in this important organ have all been realized through cooperation with the membership in maintenance of the international peace and security. Sir, we thank you for the floor.
Thank you very much, Minister Judah, and on behalf of everybody, I say thank you to you and the Hashemite Kingdom for your service, the peacekeeping you do, as well as the extraordinary work with refugees. We're all very grateful. It's my privilege now to give the floor to His Excellency, Monsieur Laurent Fabius, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Development for France.
Monsieur le Président,
President, Secretary General, colleagues,
en Syrie et pour la
in
Syrie,
Syria and for
il y a
Syria,
extrême urgence.
emergency has struck. For 5 years now, more than 250,000 dead, 4 million refugees, 13.5 million displaced persons. Daesh's terrorism has struck the heart of cities. There is an urgent need to resolve this crisis, which, quite far beyond Syria, is a threat to international peace and security. In this context, the resolution we've just adopted unanimously is a glimmer of hope and what I might call a roadmap resolution. We know, as we're part of this, that a yet tenuous political process was initiated in Vienna on the basis of the Geneva Communique, where the principles of the communique continue to be obligatory for all. This process has brought together a hitherto unseen totality of international partners. The international community must provide a credible framework for negotiations to be led between a delegation from the regime and a delegation from the opposition, mediated by the special envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations, our friend Mr. Staffan de Mistura. They will seek to establish a transition authority and facilitate a ceasefire. Our Security Council today adopts the first results of this process. Allow me to emphasize quickly a few points. My first, the matter of the opposition. We've heard some ask, what opposition? Several meetings in various formats have been held on this topic. But allow me to underscore that the recent conference convened by Saudi Arabia in Riyadh upon request of the Vienna Group is a success, which should be stressed, because the Syrian opposition has provided a response by coming together. All of the various branches of the political and armed opposition came together and expressed their commitment to a political solution, a free, secular and democratic Syria, one which has space for all of the components of Syrian society. Here we have an interlocutor, one which is guided by the Geneva Communique, the Special Envoy of the United Nations, with the High Negotiation Committee, which is the Speaker of the opposition, is holding talks. At this stage, we know that the Syrian regime has not yet demonstrated any desire to enter into serious negotiations on the basis of the terms of reference established. Now, secondly, the political transition. There are plans for inter-Syrian talks, but without our support and guarantee, it will be difficult to define a political framework which is guided by the Geneva Communique. This framework should be underpinned by many principles. First, an effective transition, one which means the handover to a transition authority of full executive power, in particular control over the military and security apparatus, as planned for by the Geneva Communique. This is a step which should be taken quite quickly. Secondly, there's a need for institutional reform, in particular in the area of security. This will allow or provide Syria with a framework which respects the diversity of the Syrian people. Finally, there must be safeguards regarding the exit of Mr. Bashar al-Assad, which is necessary for not just moral reasons, but also ones, as we've stressed, of effectiveness. How could somebody bring together a whole people when he has massacred so many? And here, whatever our ideas might be, we simply can't hide an undeniable political reality. That is, as long as Mr. Bashar al-Assad's government continues, lasting and veritable reconciliation between populations and the Syrian state would seem unattainable. Finally, allow me to share a few thoughts on the ceasefire. The ceasefire must be national, viable, verifiable, For it to be lasting, we think that at least 3 conditions should be met. First, we think the ceasefire should accompany the transition rather than precede it, and that only this transition will provide the opposition with necessary security conditions. Finally, we think there's a need to prepare the ceasefire with immediate humanitarian measures to alleviate the suffering of people and to add credibility to the political process. The compliance with international humanitarian law is a sine qua non, in particular, the immediate halting of indiscriminate attacks against civilians and unhampered access for humanitarian assistance. Confidence-building measures would be most welcome to create a foundation for the ceasefire. And finally, after such violence, monitoring of the ceasefire will be quite difficult. It will require creative solutions on the ground, but also on the political front. It'll need a mechanism through which the ISSG members, who are most concerned, and permanent members of the Security Council shall hold parties accountable for compliance with their obligations. Colleagues, by way of conclusion, in the beginning, I spoke about a glimmer of hope and a roadmap resolution. All of us around the table must contribute in good faith to create conditions conducive to a political transition which is credible in Syria. We must all bring our influence to bear to bring Syrian parties to uphold the guidelines we have set forth. In particular, as in the near future, the inter-Syrian talks will begin under the aegis of the United Nations and Staffan de Mistura. France, for its part, will remain active and vigilant. We shall be wary to ensure that all military forces can combat Daesh and eradicate terrorism. We shall be vigilant to ensure that parties, and first and foremost the regime, engage in talks and uphold humanitarian obligations. We shall ensure that the international community effectively commit to a credible transition and a lasting ceasefire. Only through these clear objectives and newfound unity, the international community can, as we hope, triumph over terrorism and halt the Syrian tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Much appreciated. I give the floor now to His Excellency Mr. Wang Yi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of China.
Mr. President, China welcomes the unanimous adoption of the resolution by the Security Council. The resolution embodies the broad consensus of the international community, demonstrates the important role of the Security Council, reflects the keen aspiration of the Syrian people, and lends fresh impetus to the political settlement of the Syrian issue. We must follow through on it with a view to translating consensus into action and expectation into reality. The protracted conflict in the past 5 years has brought Syria, a country with time-honored civilization, to ruins. Large numbers of Syrians have been displaced and unable to return to their home. What is worse, it has become a hotbed where radical ideas breed and spread, as well as a playground of terrorists, posing a grave threat to peace and security of the region and beyond. As such, the international community should work towards the political settlement of the issue with a stronger sense of urgency and responsibility. For 5 years, the international effort to seek a political settlement has been relentless. This on and off political process has its ups and downs. We need to build on successful experience, learn the lessons, and press ahead with the political process firmly and steadily so that it can be put on an irreversible path. First, we must remain committed to the goal of political settlement. What has happened tells us that the more the bloodshed, the worse the tension. There is simply no military solution to the Syrian crisis. Political negotiation is the only viable option. All warring parties must stop fighting immediately. Those organizations and individuals that reject ceasefire would find themselves on the opposition side of the Syrian people and the whole world, and will pay a costly price. The Security Council has already sent out a clear and strong message. Relevant countries, especially regional countries, should also leverage their respective influence to engage various parties of Syria and call for a meaningful ceasefire. Second, we must remain committed to the principle that the future of Syria must be independently decided by the Syrian people. No one cares more about Syria's future or knows the country better than the Syrian people. As Syria belongs to the Syrians, the political process should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned. This is consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and norms governing international relations. I want to stress that specific steps in the political transition must be independently worked out between the Syrian government and the opposition representatives through negotiation. The process for drafting a new constitution must be independently decided by all parties and groups of Syria, and the future leader of Syria must be independently chosen by the Syrian people. Other countries could help in a constructive way. The international community needs to foster an enabling environment, and all parties should create a favorable condition for that. Third, we must remain committed to having the UN serve as the main channel for mediation. UN involvement would bring more legitimacy and authority to the process. It is the largest common denominator acceptable to all parties. By Security Council mandate, the UN will formulate comprehensive ceasefire plan and promote peace talks between the government and the opposition. We look to the UN to work on both fronts steadily as mandated and play a bigger role in consolidating opposition groups, coordinating international counterterrorism efforts and other areas. The international community should render cooperation and support and assist and complement the mediation by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Special Envoy de Mistura in a constructive way. The ISSG should build on its previous efforts and continue to support the UN. Mr. President, since the outbreak of the Syrian crisis, China has all objective and just position and participated in the settlement of the issue. China does not have or pursue selfish interest on the Syrian issue. No matter how we vote for or against, the goal is always to avoid war and turmoil, give the Syrian people stability, give peace a chance, and make political settlement possible. What we are trying to do is to uphold fundamental and long-term interests of the people in Syria and the region, safeguard the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the basic norms governing international relations, and protect the legitimate interests of developing countries, especially small and medium-sized countries. The changing dynamics in the Syrian situation affects the various parties, the neighborhood, and the whole world. Its increasingly profound spillover effects have triggered severe global challenges such as terrorism and the refugee crisis, which is something we need to think long and hard about. We call on relevant parties to rise above the narrow geopolitical rivalries and a zero-sum approach for the sake of global stability and the greater good. Work together to advance political transition, jointly fight terrorism, ease the humanitarian crisis, and take a holistic approach to the refugee problem. Mr. President, instability causes suffering and conflict leaves no winner. We must join hands to help parties to the conflict bury the hatchet and build peace so that Syrian people will be able to lead a life free of fear and war. Thank you.
Minister Wang Yi, thank you very much and thank you particularly. I know you traveled all the way to be here for a day, and you're about to get a plane to rush back, and we're very appreciative for your effort. It makes an important statement. Thank you very much. Now, my privilege to recognize and give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Philip Hammond, the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs for the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the Secretary General and his Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, for all that they are doing to bring the Syrian parties together. And let me also thank you, Secretary Kerry, for the characteristic drive and energy that you have brought over recent months to this process in establishing the International Syria Support Group. This has given new momentum towards the resumption of Syrian-led talks and has brought us to this important occasion today. The resolution that we've adopted unanimously today is a further step in this work. Sadly, it is far too soon for any of us to predict an end to the Syria conflict, but I hope that we will look back on today as a significant step in that direction. Frankly, on Syria, this Council has too seldom found the unity it needed to live up to its responsibility for delivering peace and security, despite some useful but only partially implemented resolutions. This has to change. No country, no person who has been involved in Syria's destruction in the last 4 years can take any satisfaction from what has happened. On the Syria dossier, we have to concede we have all failed. We have all been losers. But by far the greatest losers are the people of Syria themselves. We have to do better, and we have to do better fast if there is not to be still more suffering. The participants in the ISSG came together behind a single aim: to support the Syrian parties to find an end to the conflict and tackle the terrorists currently operating in their country. We all share the sense of urgency which comes from witnessing the continuing deterioration of the humanitarian and security situation in Syria. The Syrian population, over 250,000 of whom have been killed and millions more forced from their homes, have borne the brunt of this conflict. This is not a humanitarian disaster, it is a humanitarian catastrophe. The ongoing indiscriminate use of weapons on civilians, especially artillery and aerial bombardments, including barrel bombs, continues to cause terror, destruction, and civilian deaths. And while Daesh poses a real threat to Syrians as well as to the wider region, it is Assad who bears the responsibility for the majority of the deaths in Syria. Mr. President, I commend Saudi Arabia for convening a broad cross-section of representatives of the Syrian opposition in Riyadh earlier this month. The agreement reached at that meeting in Riyadh and the formation of a high negotiating committee showed the determination of the Syrian opposition groups to come together, whatever their differences, to play a crucial, constructive role in talks. They reaffirmed their commitment to the implementation of the Geneva Communiqué, working towards a managed transition away from Assad and a pluralistic future for Syria. I welcome too Jordan's efforts to build consensus on identifying terrorist groups operating in Syria. Whilst it is for this Council ultimately to decide to designate any such groups, the ISSG is in a privileged position to provide information, analysis, and advice to the Council to assist it. We believe that it will take time to mature that view, and we are able to test which groups are willing to commit to a political process and a ceasefire. Mr. President, I'd like to turn to the content of the resolution and highlight the areas that will be critical to the progress of talks. First, all of us, both in this Council and in the broader international community, want to see a national ceasefire established. To have a realistic chance of success, a ceasefire must be closely aligned to progress on political transition and talks between the Syrian parties under UN auspices. We've seen previous attempts to end the conflict in Syria undermined by a lack of determination by the parties to contribute productively to talks. It is critical that the voices of all Syrians are heard in this process, including Syrian women and members of Syrian minorities. Second, there needs to be confidence amongst the parties that the political process will deliver real results, without which neither the talks nor the ceasefire will be successful. This will not be easy. 5 years of conflict has eroded confidence. Therefore, all the parties must undertake confidence-building measures, some of which are identified in the resolution we've passed today. We welcome the work being undertaken by the UN to this end and towards modalities for a ceasefire as mandated by this resolution. All parties have a duty to take care in their military actions not to cause the death of civilians, whether by deliberate or by reckless targeting. The indiscriminate use of weapons, especially the use of artillery and aerial bombardments, including barrel bombs, must stop. Medical facilities and schools have increasingly become a target for aerial bombardment, something that is abhorrent to all of us and must stop. All parties must adhere to their duties under international human rights and international humanitarian law. They must allow humanitarian agencies rapid, safe, and unhindered access throughout Syria by most direct routes. There are 13.5 million Syrians in need of humanitarian assistance. These people need to see a change to their lives if they are to have confidence in this political process and to feel its benefits. The UK is the second largest bilateral donor to the humanitarian effort in response to the Syrian conflict after the United States. But let us all do more on this front. This resolution also repeats a commitment to political transition in Syria, following the principles of the Geneva Communiqué in full and leading to free and fair elections under a new Syrian constitution within 18 months. This will involve the establishment of a transitional governing body with full executive powers and representative of all Syrians, which provides the framework for talks and an end to the conflict. This process necessarily involves the departure of Bashar al-Assad, not only for moral reasons, because of the destruction he's unleashed upon his own people, but also for practical reasons, because it will never be possible to bring peace and unity to Syria as long as he remains in office. But we must and will protect the institutions that are necessary for the future governance of Syria, and that will be possible with a representative transitional governing body and with the support of the ISSG. Mr. President, whilst we must seek to end the conflict in Syria, especially the violence that is directed against civilians, we must also join in confronting the threat posed by Daesh and other extremist groups in the country. An end to the civil war in Syria is critical to tackling Daesh in the long term. We are all clear that terrorist groups must not and will not benefit from the ceasefire we are promoting. A key consideration for the Syrians in the establishment of the transitional governing body will be the fight against terrorism. In this fight, they will have the full support of the ISSG and of the global coalition. Following the appalling attacks in Sinai, Beirut, Ankara, and Paris, this Council unanimously decided to adopt Resolution 2249, which calls on all countries to use all necessary means to combat Daesh. The UK responded to this resolution by extending the airstrikes we were already carrying out in Iraq against Daesh into Syria. In this regard, it is vital that all countries that claim to be fighting Daesh do what they say, rather than directing the bulk of their attacks against non-extremist opposition groups. There is clear evidence over the last weeks that the weakening of such groups has created opportunities for the expansion of Daesh in certain areas, the very opposite of the stated objective. Mr. President, as well as focusing on the immediate threats, we must also prepare for the future in Syria. We must reaffirm our commitment to assist in the post-conflict reconstruction of the country. Next February, in close partnership with Germany, Norway, Kuwait, and the United Nations, the UK will co-host a conference in London on humanitarian support for Syria, including a focus on civilian protection, as well as planning for stabilization. Of course, Mr. President, that conference will seek to raise the funding that is necessary to meet the United Nations appeal to support those displaced by the humanitarian crisis. But the UK is also committed to support post-conflict reconstruction efforts in Syria and has already committed to provide at least $1.5 billion to this work in the long term, in addition to the more than $1.64 billion we have so far given in humanitarian aid. And I hope in February we will see others committing to both the immediate challenge and to the long-term challenge of reconstruction. In conclusion, Mr. President, the conflict in Syria is now almost 5 years old. In that time, more than 250,000 Syrians have been killed. We all have a duty to prevent further slaughter. Despite the important step that we've taken with today's resolution, despite the progress we've made in Vienna, despite the important steps forward made at the meeting in Riyadh the week before last, there is still a very long way to go. And to have a chance of success, the United Nations will need the clear and continued support of the International Syria Support Group. And I know that I can say it will have the support of that group. But above all, we need Syrian leaders of all persuasions to take responsibility for the future of their country and to take the tough decisions needed to bring about a lasting political settlement and an end to the conflict. Because we can help, but only the Syrians themselves can bring an end to Syrian suffering. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Let me thank you personally, Secretary Hammond, for your personal engagement and collaboration on this. It's really been key, together with Frank-Walter Steinmeier and Laura Fabius and company, so we're very appreciative for the help. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Ibanez, the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Spain.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The adoption unanimously of Resolution 2254 opens a window of opportunity to embrace dialogue as a way of dealing with the crisis in Syria, which has been one of the most painful conflicts that we've experienced in decades. The main victims of this crisis are first and foremost the Syrians themselves. Today's resolution comes too late for more than 250,000 people who have lost their lives over the past 5 years. We should never forget that in Syria, fundamental norms of international humanitarian law have been violated and continue to be violated. The war in Syria is at the same time a challenge due to the implications that it has for the entire region. It has been the trigger for the escalation of the terrorism of Daesh that has become the main threat to the international community on a global scale. As co-sponsor of this resolution, Spain is keenly aware of the attacks in Paris, the attacks in Beirut, the blowing up of a commercial Russian aircraft in the Sinai, and the attacks in Ankara. The ceasefire in Syria would enable us to focus on a political solution to the conflict while we continue to fight against terrorism. Today, this is our top priority. In upcoming months, Spain will continue to actively participate in the anti-Daesh coalition in various domains, including the training of Iraqi security forces. Now, this resolution furthermore asserts the central role of the United Nations, and specifically the Security Council, that cannot continue to sit around twiddling its thumbs in the face of a conflict of this scale. The Vienna process has been essential to bring together around the negotiating table countries with very different visions, sometimes hostile visions, on the conflict in Syria. However, the United Nations should play the role of arbiter for a long-term solution, as is reflected in the responsibilities allocated by Resolution 2254 to the Secretary General, to the team of the Special Envoy Stefan Mistura, and to the Security Council itself. Mr. President, now, without the unity of the international community, we would not have achieved this. And the success or failure of this process will depend, however, first and foremost, on the Syrians themselves. The challenge is enormous. After so many years of war, it will be very difficult to close the wounds. The temptation to embrace a military solution will be there at every stage in this process. Spain has always supported a dialogue without any preconditions in Syria, knowing that the future will inevitably go through transition that leads to a new political system on the basis of the Geneva Communique. We fully support the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Staffan de Mistura, that has all the necessary qualities to successfully conduct this exercise. The setting up of confidence-building measures in the short run will be a clear sign of hope. On this point, we call on the immediate ceasing of indiscriminate attacks against the civilian population, and in particular, the use of barrel bombs by the government of Syria. In conclusion, Mr. President, yesterday we marked 5 years since the protest of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunis, which led to the Arab Spring. Also yesterday in this room, we adopted a resolution in which we committed ourselves with concrete measures to cut the umbilical cord of the financing of Daesh. Soon, I trust that this Security Council will take a position with identical firmness and unity in favor of guaranteeing humanitarian assistance to all Syrians by the most immediate channels without any hindrance or obstacles. To achieve the adoption of this resolution, Spain will be working with Jordan and New Zealand. Together we will submit for adoption next week a resolution, and I'm sure that we will have the full support of all members of the Security Council. To implement this resolution, it will be essential to have the involvement of all the parties. In these days, we have had positive news on Libya from Morocco. Progress is being made step by step in Yemen. In Syria, we have a long way ahead full of obstacles, but at least we are taking the most important step and an indispensable step so that armed clashes seed the way to diplomacy. Spain, as a member of the Security Council, will spare no effort to translate the spirit of unity and consensus in an effective commitment to peace, security, and stability in Syria and in the Middle East as a whole. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Minister. It's my privilege now to yield the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Manuel Domingo Augusto, Secretary of State for External Relations of Angola.
Thank you. We thank the United States Secretary of State, Mr. John Kerry, for presiding over this important meeting. We also welcome the adoption of this landmark resolution, which delineates the process which will bring about the end of the Syrian crisis. It is a vital step forward by pledging to support the ceasefire in Syria. We encourage all parties to abide by its provisions in order to successfully implement the Syrian-led political transition, ensuring that the continuity of governmental institutions as well as maintain the independence and territorial integrity of Syria. We urge all parties in Syria as well as the international community to maintain their focus and commitment to the principles stipulated in this resolution and in Geneva Communique. Mr. President, the conflict in Syria became one of the most appalling situations confronting the international community, with the far-reaching political, humanitarian, and economic repercussions. The Security Council has addressed this issue on numerous occasions, with the feeling of despair prevailing due to the grim situation faced by the Syrian people. The Angolan delegation, during the debates on the Syrian situation, often acknowledged its disappointment with the lack of political will by the major stakeholders to search for effective, real, and durable solutions to end this war, which has claimed the lives of so many innocent people while displacing millions. Now, as we reach the end of this year, we look forward with a sense of renewed hope due to the apparent determination by the international community to defeat terrorism and the positive momentum for a political resolution to the conflict in Syria. Mr. President, the recent upsurge of brutal terrorist attacks, namely in Paris, Beirut, Iraq, Ankara, Egypt, Bamako, and elsewhere, and the staggering refugee crisis from Syria seem to have played the role of a game changer by making the international community understand the implications of allowing conflicts to degenerate to such extent as has been the case of the crisis in Syria. People suffering under such deplorable conditions for such prolonged period of time, while international organizations and world powers are unable or unwilling to protect them, are an easy prey for recruitment by radical and extremist elements. Exclusion, poverty, and armed conflict are breeding grounds for these violent extremist groups to spread their ideology of hatred and intolerance, as is the case with ISIL or Daesh and other terrorist organizations operating in the region. It is reassuring that the international community has begun to turn the tide by taking positive steps toward the political transition in Syria that meets the legitimate aspiration of the Syrian people and will hopefully enable them to independently and democratically determine their own future, while repudiating extremist elements such as ISIL, Daesh, and Jabhat al-Nusra, among others. Mr. President, we welcome the outcomes of the recent serious talks in Vienna and the specific steps outlined with regard to the political process in Syria, notably the request for UN Secretary General Special Envoy, Mr. Staffan de Mistura, to convene a meeting with the Syrian government and opposition by January 2016. In this regard, we stress the importance of identifying members representing the entire spectrum of opposition force, and that both sides start discussing without further delay the end of hostilities, the establishment of a sustainable ceasefire as the first step towards a meaningful political process enabling a new future for Syria. It is also imperative that the parties to the conflict begin implementing confidence-building measures on the ground in order to attain the set deadlines for the political process agreed by the International Syria Support Group on a joint national unity government, on the drafting of a new constitution, and on the holding of elections based on that constitution. Mr. President, one of the most pressing issues at the moment is to put an end to the violence. As the refugee crisis demonstrates, the humanitarian catastrophe needs to be reversed by creating conditions for a ceasefire, permitting the safe return of displaced people and refugees to their homes. In the meantime, however, we shouldn't forget the collective obligation to continue providing humanitarian aid until life can be restored back to normal in Syria. In conclusion, Mr. President, we would like to reiterate our support to the principles of Geneva Communiqué and the constructive measures adopted at the Vienna meetings regarding the way forward in the resolution of the Syrian conflict. We also welcome the broad-based international coalition to fight the so-called Islamic State or Daesh and other terrorist groups. Auspiciously, it became evident that inaction was no longer suitable, given the dangerous proliferation of extremism throughout the world and its impact on the daily lives of people everywhere. A unified stand in the fight on terrorism is crucial. Terrorists can't prevail anywhere in the world. The more the international community is divided or states selfishly pursue their national interests, the more the terrorists prey on vulnerable and alienated communities in conflict-ridden areas, thereby swelling their ranks and increasingly threatening international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, Mr. Andres Augusto. Thank you very much for your statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Andrius Karas, the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Our meeting today and the adoption of Resolution 2254 mark an important step toward settlement of the most brutal conflict of this century. The peace process, started in Vienna, is long overdue, as a human tragedy continues to take place inside Syria and keeps spilling over its borders, with a particularly heavy burden on its neighbors. Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey are bearing the brunt of it. Unprecedented numbers of refugees are reaching Europe, while human traffickers and smugglers are profiting from their plight. To this very day, the civilian population continues to suffer the atrocities committed not only by terrorist groups such as Daesh, but also by President Assad's regime. Being part of the problem, President Assad cannot be seen as part of the solution to this devastating crisis. All Syrians should feel safe and have the right to be secure in a future peaceful and democratic Syria. Those who committed crimes against humanity, gross human rights violations, and mass atrocities should be brought to justice. There can be no room for impunity. An immediate halt of hostilities in Syria, leading to an end of this bloody conflict, is a matter of urgency and a moral obligation. The very first and the most urgent step is to agree on a long-term, sustainable ceasefire. It is imperative to fully open unconditional and unhindered humanitarian access to all in need, including those in besieged and hard-to-reach areas. Mr. President, at this juncture, the political momentum is fragile and still reversible. A real breakthrough requires long-term, genuine engagement, courage, and readiness to compromise by all parties to the conflict. After years of this monstrous war, there will be no winners, but there is a lot to be gained by immediately stopping the bloodshed, safeguarding the integrity and sovereignty of the Syrian state, and starting building a future for its people. We welcome the meeting by the broad range of opposition representatives recently held in Riyadh, aimed at achieving a common stance in the peace process. We see it as a beginning of the consolidation of moderate opposition and a sign of readiness to seek common solutions. In order to achieve peace and reconciliation, the Syrians will need our massive, long-term and sustained assistance in all aspects: political, security, humanitarian, reconciliation, reconstruction, and development of the country. We must continue pushing the peace process forward, seeking genuine and sustainable resolution of this conflict by putting aside differing views and interests. A strong leadership and mediation of the United Nations remains essential. In this respect, we express our appreciation to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and his special representative, Staffan de Mistura, for their efforts. A well-thought, consistent and comprehensive strategy for political transition, including reconciliation and voluntary and safe return of refugees and IDPs, must be thoroughly prepared and responsibly implemented in accordance with the 2012 Geneva Communique. Mr. President, even with a political transition soundly on track, Daesh will remain one of the biggest threats to peace and stability in the region and beyond. Along with the military means in the fight against Daesh, there will be a long and difficult battle against its poisonous ideology. This battle must be fought by the Muslims themselves, who are the primary and most vulnerable target of Daesh's murderous ideology. In order to avoid the risks of fragmentation or the creation of new frozen conflict zones in Syria, and to advance peace process and reconciliation, it is critically important for the local populations to take the lead and ownership. Women's voices, in particular, must be heard loud and clear at all stages of negotiations leading to peace and post-conflict reconstruction. The strength of Syria lies in its cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity. All pieces of this complex fabric, Muslims, Kurds, Alawites, Druzes, Turkmens, Christians, and others must play a full and integral part in the future of Syria, enjoying equal rights, safety, dignity, and inclusion in the governance of the country. Even if the political transition is to be facilitated by a third party, the final decisions on their destiny must be taken by the Syrian people themselves. Only the Syrian people can decide in what state they want to live, and we hope that they will choose an inclusive, democratic, accountable, and moderate state to avoid repeating the tragedy that marks their lives today. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for his statement and give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to first thank Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his briefing. We are of the view that by bringing the Vienna ISSG process to New York, non-participating council members are able to substantively engage on issues concerning the situation in Syria, on which we would have preferred to have more time for consultations. This is an important step in ensuring and cementing Council's unity of purpose and vision on the way forward for Syria. That the international community has a strong desire to see an end to the conflict in Syria cannot be doubted. The cost in terms of human life and destruction of property of the Syrian conflict to date is simply staggering. Such suffering and misery must end now. It is for this primary reason that Malaysia joined consensus on Resolution 2254. Madam President, we support Resolution 2254's aim of building upon the vision and principles of the Geneva Communique and the Vienna Statements, embodying the collective will of the international community to bring about a peaceful and sustainable resolution to the Syrian conflict. In this context, my delegation expresses deep appreciation to Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura for his untiring facilitation, which we fully support. Moving into its fifth year, the Syrian conflict continues to be a litany of horrific human rights abuses and violations, and most notoriously for violations of international humanitarian law through use of toxic chemicals as weapons and indiscriminate attacks against civilians perpetrated by parties to the conflict. The Syrian people are tormented further by Daesh, Al-Nusra Front, and other terrorist groups and violent extremists, exacerbated by the unprecedented influx of foreign terrorist fighters. The Syrian government must accept that it has the primary responsibility and obligation to protect its own people in accordance with established international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. We reaffirm the demand on all parties to cease all indiscriminate attacks against civilians and to cease targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure. We reaffirm condemnation of continued use of barrel bombs, aerial bombings, and artillery shelling against civilians. There can be no impunity for perpetrators of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. They must be held accountable. At the same time, Malaysia remains deeply concerned that despite the clear demand for cooperation stipulated in Resolution 2139, 2165, and 2191, delivery of humanitarian assistance remains a huge problem. All parties to the conflict, particularly the Syrian authorities, must do more to demonstrate full and effective compliance with those resolutions. Only through the peaceful resolution of the conflict could the dire and deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria begin to be meaningfully addressed, making it all the more urgent. On this note, Malaysia acknowledges the role of Syria's neighbors, particularly Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, for their steadfast resilience and for their hospitality in sheltering and caring for the millions fleeing the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, despite facing enormous capacity and resource constraints. Madam President, a fundamental element of any proposed peace process must include the implementation of a nationwide ceasefire. We are pleased that this requirement, including modalities for implementation, is explicitly outlined in 2254. The preservation of Syria's unity, independence, territorial integrity, and secular character are key factors in ensuring acceptance of any proposed political process or plan by the Syrian people. No amount of encouragement, persuasion, or pressure would be effective without the political buy-in of the Syrian people. In this connection, we call upon the Syrian government representative and representative of the opposition to spare no effort to ensure that the proposed talks shall take place in early January 2016. While noting that there are a number of contentious issues that have yet to be addressed or agreed upon, we nevertheless call on all parties to continue to dialogue constructively and further narrow down differences with a view to finding mutually acceptable solutions towards ending the conflict. Madam President, in concluding, my delegation reiterates that there can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict. The future of Syria must be determined through an inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. The Syrian government, the opposition parties, and the Syrian people cannot afford to let this opportunity pass. We believe that this Council has an obligation to support initiatives such as the ISSG or any other initiative which seeks to resolve the conflict in Syria through peaceful means. In this regard, we look forward to the full and effective implementation of Resolution 2254 by all concerned parties. I thank you, Madam President.
And I thank the representative of Malaysia for her statement and give the floor to the representative of Nigeria.
Madam President, we want to thank the delegation of the United States for convening this meeting on a subject of vital importance to international peace and security. We want to acknowledge the presence of participating foreign ministers and welcome them to the Council. We have listened attentively to our distinguished briefer, the Secretary General, and we want to thank him not only for sharing his perspectives on the subject, but also for being a moral voice in global politics. The conflict in Syria is a matter of concern to Nigeria as well. ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, and other terrorist groups associated with them are taking advantage of the situation to entrench themselves and consolidate their positions. They are committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and to this extent, they constitute a grave threat to international peace and security. Containing and defeating the terrorists should be a top priority for the international community. Achieving this will require that the Syrian conflict is resolved urgently, expeditiously, and comprehensively. The warring parties must agree a ceasefire without delay. This is a crucial first step and a valid point of departure to de-escalate the conflict and create the conditions for attaining a political solution. The establishment of the International Syria Support Group has given a much-needed momentum to the search for a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Syria. The presence of key international and regional stakeholders in the group is a clear indication that the international community is prepared to work in unison to resolve the Syrian conflict. We note the outcomes of the group's meeting of the 30th of October and 14th of November held in Vienna, and the meeting held today in New York. We support the efforts of the group to resolve the Syrian conflict on the basis of a Syrian-led political process and the Geneva Communique. The unanimous adoption of Resolution 2254 today is an unequivocal indication of the commitment of the Council to resolve the Syrian conflict. Indeed, as others have aptly noted this afternoon, it presents a clear roadmap on the way forward. We urge the warring parties to build on this momentum, the momentum of the resolution, to bring the conflict to an end and restore the much-needed peace, security, and stability in Syria.
representative of Nigeria for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, Madam President. We'd like to thank you for convening this important meeting on the peace process in Syria, as well as we'd like to welcome the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and other high-level representatives that were able to attend. Madam President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela voted in favor of this resolution, although we had very little time to get familiarized with its content, because we considered that this text reaffirms the vision that the solution to the armed conflict that has devastated this Arab country as a result of the criminal actions of terrorist groups should be political, peaceful, and negotiated. We have always been in favor of this approach. And we're happy to observe that there is a political will of the players with influence on the crisis in Syria that can pave the way for peace that the Syrian people yearns for. We need to act decisively, and we believe that this opportunity that the President of the Council has provided is a very encouraging sign. We should take this opportunity that is before us and shore up decisively the peace process in Syria, taking advantage of the impetus given in Vienna on the way to a political solution to the armed conflict. Now, along this line of thinking, the willingness can not only be expressed in words, but in concrete actions resulting from a commitment by all parties to put an end to the conflict, such as this one that has had the most severe humanitarian consequences and has affected international peace and security. We'd like to express our gratitude and support to the diplomatic efforts of Mr. Staffan de Mistura to achieve a firm and lasting peace in Syria. We are aware that identifying common elements in order to establish a basis for political negotiations is an arduous task. However, a very important one that requires the commitment of all parties to achieve concrete progress. We believe that a positive aspect of the Vienna process is the willingness to engage with the government of President Bashar al-Assad in order to find a solution to the conflict. Venezuela considers that the legitimate government of President al-Assad is one of the essential actors within the political equation that could lead to a solution of the conflict. Sidestepping this essential reality is condemning the peace process to failure. The Syrian people must reaffirm their political independence with the support of the international community, free from foreign interference and solutions imposed from outside that reflect interests that are different from those of Syria. With this in mind, Venezuela would like to reiterate its support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Syria, as well as its right to self-determination in conformity with international law, including the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Madam President, the solution to the humanitarian crisis in Syria is linked to the end of hostilities. Continuation of the conflict will aggravate the already tragic humanitarian situation and will create greater instability while having an impact on neighboring countries that have taken in millions of refugees fleeing the war. Furthermore, it is essential to draw up as quickly as possible the lists of opposition groups and terrorist groups in order to move forward with the agenda proposed by the International Syria Support Group this past November. The opposition groups should be aware that they need to sit down to negotiate with the Syrian authorities in a constructive spirit to achieve a political and peaceful solution to the conflict. With this in mind, the designation of terrorist groups in this process, there should not be any double standards with good and bad terrorists. This aspect is very important because the government of Syria is waging a merciless battle against the terrorist organizations ISIS and Al-Nusra Front, amongst others, which have expanded their activities to other countries of the Middle East, North Africa, and other regions. If the international community does not act decisively to prevent the financing, training, and transfer of arms to these groups, as well as stop their use and encouragement as instruments to topple governments, all peoples will continue to pay a very high price to achieve the peace and security that they yearn for. In this context, it's important to strengthen international cooperation in combating terrorism. And on this point, any action with a goal of combating combating ISIS and other international organizations has our support, but on the understanding that these actions should be coordinated with the Syrian authorities. This is why the effective implementation of the resolutions approved by the General Assembly and the Security Council pertaining to combating terrorism, including Resolution 2178, 2199, and 2253, is extremely important as part of this strategy designed collectively to put an end to the financing, supply of arms and training to terrorist groups and other armed and violent non-state actors that then become allies of ISIS and the al-Nusra Front in different parts of the world, making them a serious global threat to international peace and security. Madam President, we need to avoid a collapse of Syria and its institutions, as stated in the Vienna Communique. This aspect is crucial because we cannot repeat the traumatic experiences of Iraq and Libya with their terrible consequences. Lastly, our country and our government will continue working to achieve peace and put an end to this terrible conflict with our modest cooperation within this Security Council on the basis of a political and negotiated solution led by the Syrian people, its government and institutions, guaranteeing thus the sovereignty and independence of this brethren Arab country. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Venezuela for his statement and give the floor to the representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Secretary Kerry and the United States for convening today's meeting and preparing the resolution that we adopted today. We also acknowledge and thank the other foreign ministers for coming to our meeting today. We appreciate that the meeting and the resolution were convened under significant time pressures, and for that reason we are prepared to go along with, if not entirely welcome, the short time with which we had to consider the resolution. Madam President, the collapse of Syria into the nightmare of civil war has resulted in the spread of insecurity throughout the world. Assad's cruel response in 2011 to peaceful civilian protest and ongoing breaches of international humanitarian law have fueled extremism and terrorism. They have precipitated the foreign terrorist fighters phenomenon. For Syrians, the conflict has meant death, suffering, destruction, and displacement on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The conflict has produced the biggest exodus of people since the Second World War. Syria's neighbours, especially Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, have borne the brunt. The conflict has further destabilised Iraq and given rise to appalling atrocities. And the destabilising impacts have now reached Europe. The international community and this Security Council must accept a share of the blame. The devastation in Syria demonstrates beyond any doubt the need for effective conflict prevention and for Council unity in achieving this. The fact that we could today come together at last and adopt this landmark resolution in a short time reflects the determination of the international community to end this conflict. We welcome in particular the continued close engagement between the Security Council and the International Syria Support Group. As we move forward, it must be a time for acceptance. All involved in the Syrian tragedy must accept that no side can win militarily. The Assad government and the opposition fighters must accept that, however much more death and destruction they inflict on their country, there will be no victory. They and those external actors who have serious political stakes in how the Syrian conflict is resolved must accept that political solutions mean political compromise. Any who insist on political red lines that block the necessary compromises will have to measure the delay that they cause in terms of more lives lost, more refugees, and more suffering. Delay plays into the hands of the extremists like ISIL. Compromise requires a willingness to take difficult decisions, to give and to take, to accept ultimately an outcome that may be short of initial positions. A political solution will be imperfect, but it is necessary. Madam President, in July this year, 6 countries came together with Iran and found a political solution to one of the most difficult issues of the last decade. My foreign minister, who was presiding over the Council at the time of the resolution adopting the solution to the Iran nuclear issues, challenged his Council members to apply the same courage and commitment to a political solution for Syria. The formation and meetings of the support group have given us hope there is at last a way out of this conflict. The support group benefits from its inclusive membership and from the ambition and capacities of the major powers involved. It also has benefited from focusing on the issues that all agree, working together to counter terrorism, to ensure the survival of state institutions in Syria, and to end violent conflict. That is positive, but big questions remain. The first is the need for a comprehensive ceasefire. The second is that offensive operations must be immediately and exclusively focused on ISIL, al-Nusra Front, and any other terrorist organisations designated as such by this Council. And these operations must be carried out in a way that protects civilians. Third, we recognise the process being led by Jordan to add to the list of designated terrorist organisations as envisaged in Resolution 2249. But until there is agreement, we should proceed on the basis that peace in Syria will not be served by a hasty approach that defines far too many people as terrorists. Fourthly, Assad's future is an issue for the intra-Syrian process to decide. We agree with the Secretary General that it is unacceptable to let one person take the political negotiation process hostage. Answers to other difficult questions will also be needed. These include the sequencing of the ceasefire and the mechanics of the transition, including ceasefire monitoring, long-term mechanics for guaranteeing security and coalescing the Syrian opposition. On this last point, we welcome the efforts of Saudi Arabia. On all of these issues, New Zealand encourages key players to prioritise pragmatism and an end to the conflict over other interests. New Zealand supports a Syrian-led political transition process that is fully inclusive, representative, and provides for the protection of groups within Syria. This Council has a role also in reminding all that political solutions do not mean giving up core values. It is clear that the Syrian government's resistance to the core value of inclusiveness has been a key factor in perpetuating recruitment conditions for violent extremist groups. We firmly believe that the day will come and must come when there will be accountability. In the meantime, we must do all we can to reduce suffering, open humanitarian access, build trust and protect civilians. Ending indiscriminate attacks and releasing political prisoners are also critical. An immediate next responsibility for the Security Council is to renew the mandate for cross-border and cross-line humanitarian assistance. The arrangements in place have facilitated the UN and others to help millions of people. The draft resolution that has been prepared by New Zealand, Jordan and Spain reflects developments over the last year. Its adoption is urgent, and we call on all our Council colleagues to join us in adopting the resolution very soon. Finding a solution has taken too long, but we finally have an opening. Let us make 2016 the year when we end the fighting, work together to counter terrorism, and start to rebuild Syria. Thank you.
I thank the representative of New Zealand for his statement and give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the presence of Secretary of State John Kerry, as well as the ministers and deputy ministers that are with us. We hope that Resolution 2254 will contribute to a ceasefire and the beginning of formal negotiations that will lead to a lasting peace in Syria. My delegation would have liked to have had more time to examine the text of the resolution. Madam President, the recent meetings of the International Syria Support Group are a step forward on the path of dialogue, bringing together on the same table international actors and relevant regional players with an influence on the parties to the conflict. The next step, however, is to overcome the substantive differences that exist, and as stated by the Secretary General, to be able to reduce those differences and to build areas of common understanding. We believe that it's essential to include all Syrian stakeholders that are willing to reach a political solution to achieve a lasting peace. The Geneva Communiqué is clear. This should be a Syrian-led political process. This implies, in addition to the active and meaningful participation of women also. Parties have an obligation vis-à-vis the Syrian people to commit themselves firmly towards reaching an agreement, and our role as the international community is to support them. Any political solution should preserve independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. The state institutions of this country should remain intact to avoid situations where erosion and institutional collapse lead to catastrophic consequences for the civilian population. We should also unite ourselves to combat terrorism that has had a devastating effect on Syria and many other countries, and we value the unity that this Council has demonstrated in tackling this threat over the past few weeks. However, these efforts should not stop the political process. Indeed, ceasefire is the only way to tackle the humanitarian crisis. Let's not forget that the civilian population, including millions of children, have been affected by this crisis, by this civil war. Nor can we envision lasting peace without justice, accountability, and reconciliation. The political solution, however, will continue to remain distant as long as the militarization of the conflict continues. Thank you.
Of Chile for his statement, and give the floor to the representative of Chad.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank the United States for having organized this meeting, a ministerial meeting on Syria. I'd also like to thank Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the United Nations Secretary General, for his statement. President, the situation in Syria remains a source of great concern. The war in that country has lasted far too long, and the Syrian people continue to bear the brunt of it. It is high time to take stock of Security Council action on the conflict, with its multifaceted and multidimensional consequences. In spite of the adoption by the Security Council of several resolutions and statements on the situation in Syria, clearly, war goes on with its funeral march of atrocities, displacement of innocent civilians and their death, as well as destruction of vital infrastructure for the country. In spite of the complexity of the Syrian crisis, the international community must not give up, nor should it spare any effort in moving forward on the political process for a lasting and acceptable political transition for all parties concerned. Along these lines, we would call upon all parties to the conflict to make reason a priority rather than force, and to commit resolutely to dialogue so as to put an end to this endless spiral of violence. It's clear that there's no military solution to the Syrian crisis. Solely an inclusive political process can put an end to the conflict, where the provisional human deaths are reaching more than 250,000 deaths, including 2,000 children. Hundreds of thousands of wounded, more than 7,000 internal displaced persons, and more than 4 million refugees. President Chad welcomed the holding this morning in New York of the ISSG, and warmly welcomes the diplomatic efforts of its initiators, including, namely the U.S. and Russia, as well as regional and international partners. We hope that the new dynamism created by the Vienna and New York conferences, as well as bolstered by the just adopted resolution, will allow us to overcome differences and to set up a political transition in line with the roadmap already established, as well as the Geneva Communique, and in full compliance with the unity, independence, and sovereignty of Syria. In order for this to happen, we would call upon regional players to play a constructive role, which would encourage parties to demonstrate flexibility and to commit in good faith and without preconditions to the political process. The option of peace requires sacrifices and concessions from both sides. Continuing war is not just disastrous, but it also provides a breeding ground for the spread of terrorist groups such as Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, could destabilize the whole region. The scope of this threat is a threat for the world, for the entire world. In a region rocked by several crises, equally serious, the rapid settlement of the Syrian crisis needs to happen immediately and requires consistency and commitment of all regional and international partners for peace and peace in Syria. It is along these lines that Chad voted in favor of 2254, hoping that the resolution might help us move forward towards peace in Syria. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Chad for his statement, and before I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, I just want to take this occasion on behalf of Secretary Kerry to thank all council members for moving very quickly today in pursuit of a unified message to the world and unity for this Security Council resolution. I know it wasn't easy for many delegations, so sincere gratitude from our delegation, and I think from all the members of the ISSG who worked on the resolution and sought to enshrine its key provisions. With that, I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا السيدة الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam President.
أيها السادة الزملاء والزميلات الأكارم.
Colleagues, honorable ladies and gentlemen, the meeting of the Security Council yesterday has witnessed a very important step in the combat against terrorism by adopting Resolution 2253. And here we are today witnessing another important meeting at the ministerial level on my country, Syria. What I want here and in this council, that the situation in my country, Syria, should be read in an objective and correct manner instead of adopting positions that intensify the crisis and prolong it, and to help to the spread of anarchy and terrorism, and to the embezzlement of my country and the repetition of failed assumptions that caused havoc and destruction in more than one country. The government of Syria wants a combating of terrorism based on the principles of law and not as a result of fear and a reaction to terrorist acts that may happen here and there outside Syria. Madam President, the Syrian government remained open towards any initiative or sincere efforts to help it overcome the present crisis. Thus, and as you all know, and based on its national responsibilities and to maintain the interests of its people, have shown great cooperation and commitment to the efforts of the United Nations, starting with the mission of Mr. Kofi Annan to that of Mr. Al-Akhdar Ibrahimi, until we reached the mission of Mr. Stefan de Mistura, who was with us and just left the hall. Today, I reiterate the readiness of the Syrian government to participate effectively in any sincere efforts where the Syrians alone will determine their choices through a Syrian dialogue under Syrian leadership and without foreign intervention, in a manner that would maintain the independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria. This has been reaffirmed by all the relevant Security Council resolutions on Syria. However, regrettably enough, we had noted that some countries do affirm the sovereignty of Syria in the resolution of the Security Council, but do violate them on the ground by supporting the terrorist groups and by sending its military aircrafts to bomb its oil installations and economic and infrastructure, and by imposing unilateral sanctions on the Syrian people. Madam President, the success of any political path in Syria requires that the government of Syria be an integral part and party, and therefore there must be coordination and cooperation with the Syrian government on all the aspects of this path if we want success. In parallel, the success of the political path requires an international commitment and a sincere and real political will from all, notably those countries that have direct influence on the parties that undermine the political path and those that provide them with a lifeline. And while the international community emphasizes that there is only one solution, and that is the political solution, there are those who do irresponsibly echo and repeat without any accountability that they will resort to the military solution and gives names to its failed initiatives, such names as the storms, the volcanoes, the cyclones, or the tornadoes. It has become quite clear that the success of the political process is predicated on a serious, and effective and collective combating of terrorism. Hence, my country welcomes the adoption of Resolution 2253 by the Security Council and appreciates the initiative of the friendly Russian Federation and their sincere efforts to submit that resolutions, which have complemented, strengthened and added important dimensions not fully covered on the previous resolutions of the Security Council on combating terrorism by imposing clear unambiguous obligations on those countries that support terrorism, notably the implementation of resolutions 2170, 2178, 2199. Resolution 2253 has responded to several preoccupations raised by our delegation and through the previous years. Consequently, my country joined the countries sponsoring Resolution 2253, and it is our hope that this resolution would be a turning point to close the gap between words and deeds and to lay basis for a real international alliance to combat terrorism. We do not want hollow, unrealistic alliances led by the supporters of terrorism only to erode the stipulations of the resolutions to combat terrorism, and certainly not selective alliances that violate the sovereignty of states or divisive alliances that only service the designs of ISIL, Daesh and Al-Qaeda with their Kfiri ideology. Madam President, we are aware that restoring peace and stability in all parts of Syria require that we deal immediately with the threat posed by terrorism within international legitimacy and to face realities on the ground in a practical and pragmatic manner. Consequently, the government of the Syrian government is ready to put an end to combating in areas where there are Syrian armed groups in order to realize national reconciliation in a manner that would restore normalcy to those parts and the institutions of the state and public services to those regions, and whereby the armed groups will give up their arms in order to settle their conditions and to get to be pardoned. We have successful experiments in this field, and there are experiences that are being carried on now. The Syrian government seeks to expand these reconciliations to restore stability and security. But for terrorist groups and mercenaries like Daesh, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other terrorist groups, the Syrian government will never engage in any dialogue and will continue fighting them until we eradicate them. Madam President, all honorable Syrians are called to participate in the political process on national basis in order to develop and build Syria, to restore security and stability to Syrian territory. And all Syrians have to put ahead of them that the solution can only be a Syrian solution through a comprehensive political process that responds to the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people through the national dialogue which brings all under the umbrella of the state in order to establish a secular, pluralistic state where all are equal before the law, a state where chances are open without any discriminations, and where the Syrian people alone would lead their leadership with freedom, transparency, and without any foreign intervention or influence. In conclusion, my attention was drawn by glaring contradictions in some of the statements of the speakers today. And that is, on the one hand, they emphasize that only the Syrian people are to decide their future without any foreign interventions at a time when they have delved into issues of sovereignty relating to the issue of presidency in my country, a matter that is the prerequisite of the Syrian people alone, as is mentioned in the operative paragraph 1, and I quote, stresses that the Syrian people will decide the future of Syria, end of quote. This type of intervening to one basics of sovereignty in my country only exposes the real intentions of the policies of those speakers who went out of the context of the resolution before the ink dry. They started. It's a resolution that they have just adopted and agreed, but they started interpreting its provisions in the manner they want. This is not a promising behavior. This does not instill confidence in what we hear and what we do. Thank you, Madam President.
There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before I adjourn the meeting, I just want to alert council members to the fact that we will shortly likely be starting our subsequent meeting on the Iraq-Turkey situation, and we do not have precise timing from the delegations on that, but it will be in the very near future. So if delegations could hang around, we'd be grateful. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.